All right, welcome back, everybody, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. We're back again, our first episode of June, and we are going to be talking about the pandemic, but more specifically, the pandemic era of wrestling and how we are hopefully saying goodbye to it as we experienced this past weekend, obviously with Double or Nothing taking place in front of a full crowd, but AEW announcing they're going back on the road, WWE is going back on the road. We are getting back to normalcy, both in society, but more important in the world of professional wrestling, which is way more important than reopening in society, as far as I'm concerned. I want to see shows full of people. Jason, how are you feeling about? Hopefully, I want to always knock on wood. I know we can always go. We can always, a few months from now, we're back in Daly's Place. We're back at the Performance Center. We're back at the Thunderdome. But Jason, how are you feeling about the light at the end of the tunnel and seeing wrestling return to the way that we remembered it and how everyone remembers it?
Yeah, I'm super stoked. Like obviously, we live in Massachusetts. It's our local promotions here. Beyond Wrestling, they're doing shows with fans again.
Indies are back. Yeah, indies are back.
Yeah. I mean, just especially with like full crowds, it's just not really like a fear of like everyone being together. Because I like before in the indies, but it was always like way too early in the pandemic, and it's like, oh wow, there's no social distancing, no one's wearing face masks. But now, like recently, Nick Gage, he came out. It was like during his Dark Side of the Ring, everyone's crowding around him, and it felt good to see that. People crowding around, mosh pitting Nick Gage in an indie show again. It was a cool sight to see. And of course, Double or Nothing. A lot of the matches, like some of the matches did it felt for me, but still, the crowd really helped out some of the matches for me in terms of match quality, and that's a rare sight to see, especially in a year plus of not seeing crowds at all, or just the wrestler crowds that AEW had, which like was artificial. Like you never really knew, like, oh, is this really popular, or is just people just being paid to scream and shout and or boo others.
Yeah, with Double or Nothing, I I had watched the pre-show match, which I think a lot of people did watch. But if you didn't watch that,
Yeah.
then the first match. So I had watched the pre-show match, which was very good.
Mhm.
Riho versus Serena Deeb. I recommend anyone that might have skipped it go out and watch it. I think it's probably available right on YouTube.
Mhm.
And then so I saw that match, and then we had Brian Cage versus Hangman Page, and like a few minutes into that match, I was like, okay, it's going to be really difficult for this show to not be very good because there was just this unbelievable amount of energy in the building, and people were over, and people were getting booed, and people were getting organically chants, and fans were reacting, and it was so missed. And I think most wrestling promotions did the best they could in creating an atmosphere during the pandemic era that would at least try to make the show feel a little bit lively.
Mhm.
But it has nothing compared to just the full sold out audience making noise. And it was just so refreshing. It made the show one of the most enjoyable professional wrestling shows I've ever seen. It's maybe not, it was a very good show in a vacuum, like from just a overall like match quality standpoint, in my opinion. But just as much, how much fun I had when I was watching it. When the second match, which would have been, I think, the Jon Moxley versus Eddie Kingston match, and Jon
Yeah.
Moxley's entrance, which everyone should go out and see, when he comes out through the crowd to Wild Thing, and Eddie's behind him, and he's wearing the Bad News Bears shirt, and the crowd is going crazy. I'm like, wrestling is awesome. When wrestling is good, there is nothing better than it. That is why we are all fans. We love to complain about it. We love to talk about things that we think can do better, things that, mistakes that were made. But the reason we are all fans is for moments like that, when just someone just comes across like a super badass and the crowd is going crazy and there's this energy and momentum. And that's all we ever want out of wrestling. We want that kind of feeling. And even though there were some really good moments during the pandemic era, we saw some great matches, there were some amazing promos, there were some great feuds. We weren't seeing the best of professional wrestling because we didn't have the fans. And Double or Nothing was, in my opinion, kind of like the return of fans to professional wrestling because, WrestleMania had way more fans than Double or Nothing. They had like 5 times as many fans, but it was in the big football stadium. They were spread out. The noise level wasn't that much. I don't even really remember that much about like what the crowd's reaction to stuff was at WrestleMania. Like I remember they cheered for Drew and they cheered for Bianca Belair and they booed Roman Reigns, but I don't really remember like, oh, remember that big pop, so and so got, or that person was so over. It was just it was better than nothing, but it wasn't like a real environment like we saw at Double or Nothing. And in Japan, yes, they have pretty high density crowds, or did. But they weren't allowed to make noise, and they were only allowed to clap, and that ended up feeling kind of hollow. So this was what Double or Nothing was really, in my opinion, the return of the real, honest to God, professional wrestling fans, and in relation to that, the return of honest professional wrestling that we all have grown to enjoy, and why we love professional wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Like the big part of figure out who's over is the fans. We could look at TV ratings, minute by minute numbers, all we want. That's basically all we've been doing over the past year. That's definitely a good barometer, but the fans are a good barometer of who's over, who's like super, in depth with the fans. Jon Moxley is definitely that kind of guy. Like we knew Jon Moxley was popular, but when you see him in a crowd, he is the top star in the world when you see that guy with a fan base. And even in Japan as well, you mentioned before, all their loud was clap, but the one moment that stood out when the fans actually gasped, obviously the best Super Junior final for Romu and El Desperado, when Desperado takes off his mask, the fans were so shocked that they popped, and that stood out over all the clapping. That's what made it even more memorable during that time.
I didn't really like the clap crowds that much, but I did live for those brief moments where the crowd broke, because they're so disciplined in Japan, and the crowds were so good at following the rules and stuff that you would probably never be able to get away with a lot of American wrestling fans. But when there were those few moments where the crowd would actually be like, oh, like they would all like, because you can't contain it. If something was that cool, you wouldn't be able to be like, oh, I can't talk right now. You just have the natural spontaneous reaction. I know when Ospreay beat Ibushi for the title, and everyone was like, oh, I'm like, that is a moment. And in Japan, it was hard because, people would make the argument like, oh yeah, they were clapping extra hard for so-and-so, because it's like, I don't know. It's hard to tell. I mean, we can get into it more unless you want to just go right into Japan when it comes to talking about the pandemic era. But one of the things was, and you touched on what you just said, is that we didn't know who was over. We had no idea. Moxley, like I knew Moxley was over because we saw him pre-pandemic, but there's been so much, people have been pushed. There's been character development. There's been heel turns. There's been babyface turns. We didn't really know who was truly over with the fans. Just to go back on Double or Nothing, I was told that Eddie Kingston had no idea how over he was. Like he just had no idea. Like because he's been, he's done great work, but he's been doing it in front of, sparsely populated arenas at Daly's Place. And he hasn't been in front of a live crowd, and that it was almost a shock to him. Not a shock, but he was like, he just was unaware that like people would all be chanting his name for him in a match where he's with Moxley and working against the Young Bucks, who are three of the biggest acts in the company. And he's right there with them. And that was cool because, Eddie Kingston was not known by a lot of wrestling fans pre-pandemic. His entire run on National Wrestling came during the pandemic era. And, other people, like, we didn't even see some of them on Double or Nothing, but I heard that, dark matches and such, that like Tay Conti was really over. Jungle Boy was really over live. And we saw that at the Casino Battle Royal, another guy who got over, more during the pandemic era. Trying to think who else. Darby, more, again, was over before pre-pandemic, more over now, obviously, just a much bigger star than he was a year and a half ago. Even like Hangman we knew was a star. And if you remember, Hangman was really starting to build a lot of momentum from like a crowd reaction standpoint right when the pandemic hit. And since then, he's been around. He's been mostly kept out of really big feuds. He's been kind of used. They're keeping him warm, but they're not putting him in anything major. But he came out at the start of Double or Nothing. First guy I think he came up before Cage. Maybe he came out second, but music hits, and he got a huge pop. And I was like, okay, Hangman's going to be fine. He didn't lose anything during the pandemic. he's not having his momentum stalled. He's still really over. And it's interesting that you mentioned like, oh, we go over TV ratings and that can kind of tell us something if you do minute by minute or quarter sections. Like Darby's quarters have been doing really well. Therefore, we can assume that Darby's over, and at least over in a way that really matters, which is people are interested in seeing him. But I've heard, historically, this is what Dave Meltzer has said, it's that historically people get over live first, and then they start having an impact as things like television ratings and moving up your quarterly segments doing really well. The fans you get over live first, and then everyone else kind of follows. I know like that was the old maximum around like Madison Square Garden back in the old days, was like if you got over at the Garden first, or you got over at Philadelphia first, you would then get over, that was a sign that you'd get over in other places, because that was kind of the first spot where the fans were ahead of the curve on what would be popular. And I've heard that. So it's really interesting if we see like people who, I mean, it's a natural inclination. If people are really into Jungle Boy and they're popping for him, people at home who maybe don't know that much about Jungle Boy or don't feel that invested in Jungle Boy will become more interested and invested in him, because they'll be like, who is this guy that the crowd is going crazy for? And then they become a bigger star that way. So you can't even have TV stars really without that live crowd.
Yeah, I think we saw that like in the early couple weeks, months of the pandemic, where TV ratings were they're kind of lagging a bit because like people were sure what to make of this new wrestling environment of wrestling. Like AEW hadn't really figured out their pandemic plan with all the COVID testing and the rest of the crowds yet. WWE, of course, they were in the Performance Center for so long, and it was just very empty, just in terms of the crowd and the environment as well. And so that's what really hurt those TV ratings. Because it wasn't an enjoyable watching experience. The matches may have been good, but still, it wasn't really entertaining to watch on television. And so I think that plays into that as well. Where like, we had a inkling because they're coming out Revolution and some big storylines there, but other than that, like they're still trying to build up to the next pay-per-view in Double or Nothing, so they haven't really established anyone just yet. Obviously John Moxley was champion throughout the whole pandemic era, and so that really hurt him as well, and that's a really big story point as well. Drew McIntyre as well was a champion throughout most of the pandemic, and knows what would have happened with his title run, how we would perceive that now if he had fans, cheering for him.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. People like Drew's thing. It sucked for Drew. It sucked that he got his big push and just didn't get the kind of fan momentum, because I think he's over. He was over at WrestleMania. I think it's different now because there's been a year of booking decisions around him. But I feel like last summer, post WrestleMania, he would have felt like he was really over if he had a chance for the live crowd, because I think most fans like Drew, and he had gotten the big win at WrestleMania over Brock Lesnar. He was the champion. I feel like he did get momentum, but it's tough in the non-pandemic era. The other thing when it comes to like that immediate period where things started shutting down and WWE went into the Performance Center and AEW had those shows at QT Marshall's school or his warehouse in car alarm's going off. I'm just gonna shut the window. But yeah, when they first started shutting down, they didn't have a lot of people were like, oh, the pandemic is only going to last like a month or two. So if from a wrestling promotion standpoint, you didn't want to give away a bunch of stuff in the pandemic era. You kind of just want to kill some time and hope to come back in a month or two. AEW had the blood and guts match between the Inner Circle and the Elite. That was going to be like their huge match that was supposed to take place. And it wasn't like they just said, okay, blood and guts is going to take place, at QT Marshall's school, or it's going to take place at Daly's place. They basically axed it for the whole year and didn't come back and do it until earlier this year. And I think a lot of companies had, that was just a similar philosophy. It's like, why would we go all in on this thing during when we don't have fans, when we could be doing something when we do have fans? I think things like big signings, like CM Punk was rumored to come back like a million different times during the pandemic. But it's like, why would you bring CM Punk back if you cannot bring him back in front of full fans so they can pop? Like, that's going to be like, like CM Punk walking out the Thunderdome is going to be like so anticlimactic to like CM Punk like debuting at like in Chicago somewhere at a big show, whether it's a AEW or WWE pay-per-view. So I think that was a thing for the pandemic. Let me ask you, like, how long, if it ever kind of, how long would you say it took you to kind of become adjusted to pandemic era wrestling, where there were no fans, where they were in whatever WWE and AEW and other wrestling promotions were respectively doing? Because some people never got into it, never got over it. I myself felt like a few weeks in, I had become completely adjusted to it. And while it wasn't as exciting as wrestling with fans, I could tolerate it and enjoy it considerably. But how would you say like your reaction to like just overall the pandemic era was, and how long it took you to kind of become adjusted to? Because some people never got into it. They just like, I'm done.
Mhm.
Let me know when fans come back, or they just complain the entire time how there weren't fans.
Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to you. I think it took like a couple weeks, about a month and a half, until I fully immersed myself to like, okay, like don't expect anything from reactions or anything like that. Just focused on the in-ring product and everything else that's going on in the ring. Like don't pay attention to all the emptiness that's around the performance center, or just, you know, in the QT Marshall's place, you know, get used to this new environment that we're in. And yeah, it took a lot of adjusting, but I also say that um, when AEW introduced the wrestling crowds, the crowds were like the enhancement talent or any other talent from their roster would be in the crowd. I think initially that was a breath of fresh air because that added noise to the environment. But I would say in the last couple months, I started getting tired of those wrestling crowds because it just felt so artificial. You know, like you know, the fans do sing along with Judas. Well, when Jericho does come out and the inner circle comes out, but I kind of got a bit. I kind of got tired of the wrestling crowds sing along to that song as well. It just felt so artificial. They're obviously, you know, getting paid for it, which like is no problem at all to me, but still just seeing that as a viewer, I wasn't really into it as much, seeing all the wrestlers, you know, out doing being over the top and all that other stuff, especially since like you hear these interviews where like they're encouraged to do that. Hey, if you do that a little bit more, you know, if you impress within the crowd, you'll get a bit of a push on dark. You know, I just kind of got tuned it out. I kind of got tired of it in the last couple months or so for the wrestling crowds.
Yeah, I mean, it was a smart move at the time. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if you go back, especially if you go back and watch WrestleMania last year, WWE took, I think, the Thunderdome, even though I think it was kind of like alarmingly Kubrickian when I first saw it. I was like, why are all
Sure.
these screens here? Like, it's a little like scary almost. But when WWE got to the Thunderdome, they kind of eventually got around to doing it and doing the best I think they could. AEW had advantage by being able to introduce real wrestling fans. You know, I forget when they officially, but I think it was sometime around late summer, early fall.
Yeah,
Maybe
sounds
it
about
was like
right.
winter was coming. They had them, but it was
Mm-hmm.
before that. So let's say the fall. You know, introducing some I think it was probably like most nights between 500 and 1,000 fans. Some nights they got a few more. That at least helped because they could show fans and they could show people with signs and they would sing Judas, and that did help. But I thought AEW did a better job for the most part right out of
Yeah.
the gate by having the wrestlers at ringside. WWE had this massive problem. Again, if you go back and watch WrestleMania, it's really evident of just doing nothing. No fans, no like special effects, no Thunderdome, no wrestlers at ringside. And they had it just felt like they were wrestling in this cave where there was no energy at all. And the WWE wrestling style is so much based around like saying there's a lot of criticisms of it, but some of it is based around like you do this spot, then you stand up, then you look at each other, and the crowd chants, "This is awesome!" Or you do like you're taught to work in front of an audience and to get the audience involved in your match, which is great. But when it's so, you know, showcasey and it's so like overproduced to do all that stuff, when you're doing that, you're doing all that same stuff in front of a crowd, or in front of no crowd and there's no one reacting, but you're standing and doing the standoff like you're expecting there's a chant. It just came across as really strange, and it took a while for the wrestlers to adapt to that. But what killed WWE early was just the moments of dead silence when the announcers weren't talking and there wasn't something like a big move happening in the ring. And you would just hear, like, you could hear a pin drop. And it wasn't like for super long lengths of time. It wasn't like it was just a minute of that. But every time you heard it, you're like, what is this? This is awful. I cannot watch. It's so boring. Eventually, they got better at crowd noise. They brought in the Thunderdome. They had the fake crowd noise, which had its pros and its cons, but at least kept that dead silence, which I felt like was just such a killer to the product. The fake crowd noise for WWE, WWE never, they like didn't use fake crowd noise for a while, which I was like, that's stupid. And then they went completely overboard with it to the point that I don't know if they can go back to like not doing it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think, Vince McMahon loves control. He's been at war with the fans over the last 5 years, pushing people they didn't want, not pushing people they did want, getting, it's easy to forget because they've been gone for, over a year. But WWE crowds were, especially at bigger shows, like really, like there was this whole thing where if they went to Toronto or they went to Chicago or they went to New York City or they went to these like really fan based large cities that had a really hardcore fan base, when they went there, the crowd would just chant for like, the opposite of what Vince wanted them to do. And they would say the disclaimer, oh, we're here in Bizarro World. They'll chant for the bad guys and they'll boo the good guys. But, it doesn't count because they're like dumb Canadians or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They would always say that when they were in Canada. And that was a real dynamic. And when those fans went away and they were in the Thunderdome and Vince can control everyone's cheering and booing with a button, I think that was really appealing to them. And I wonder that, they did some crowd sweetening pre-pandemic too.
Mm-hmm.
You would hear it sometimes, especially when it came to Roman Reigns.
Yep.
But now I feel like I don't think they're going to give up that power. I think that they like that idea. They like being in control of what kind of message they're sending to the viewers by saying this guy is over and this guy is not over. What do you think about that? What do you think about like WWE's future when it comes to using the kind of canned crowd noise? Because I think AEW is just going to boot it. Like, I don't think they're going to look back. And they don't have to, because the people that they push as baby faces are generally over. And the people that they push as heels are generally booed. And even if they're not, who cares? Because they're all over. WWE has a different dynamic with its fan base. And I think that control is more appealing on their end.
Yeah, especially like just touching on the AEW point real quick. Look at Britt Baker at Double or Nothing. She's the top heel, but she's still getting cheered because they're winning the title. But they're not booing Sheeta. They're just both women in the match, and so the AEW didn't do anything about it. It just didn't care. I think they'll take that approach. In the future as well. Britt Baker, she'll just be, they'll just take however it is with the crowds, with how they react to her, whether they want to cheer as a heel or as a face or whatever. But for WWE, it just turns out to be, the worst curse ever for the fans, giving Vince McMahon all this power to control the crowd reactions, because you're right. It was awkward to hear all the silence and you hear all the bumps a lot more, but it wasn't as effective as it would like in a movie sense, where you do hear all the sound effects, that really is effective for a movie environment.
The Strowman train whistle.
Oh yeah, the Strowman train whistle, that's gonna be missed as well. But there's just so many things that they can do, and I do agree that they'll probably sweeten it, especially for Roman Reigns. We still don't really know how fans will react. He was kind of booed at WrestleMania, but still how mixed in with the audio sweetening as well, and so it's really hard to figure out okay, how are fans reacting to Roman Reigns and this new character?
Roman's the only person on SmackDown who feels like they have any star power at this point. So I feel like people are going to cheer for him because he's the only person that feels like they're a real star, at least on SmackDown. With AEW, they've been pretty open, basically saying that we don't really, Cody has said a lot, we don't really care about babyface heel. We're not tied down to people being represented like that. And I like that. I think that's a more mature approach instead of turning Britt Baker's getting cheered. We need to make her a babyface now because she's being cheered. When kind of the reason she started getting cheered is because she did this heel turn where she was a really good antagonist. And I think it's okay to have, it's okay to have a heel that's popular, and the fans kind of like, if your babyface is also popular and the fans kind of like that. Like they weren't booing Hikaru Shida. They weren't, when she was getting offense and people weren't booing. They weren't anti-Shida. They were, she got cheers and stuff too. So it wasn't like there was this total inverse where the heel was the babyface, the babyface was the heel. It was more like a babyface versus babyface match because both people were popular. And I think that's fine. I think it's a more mature and evolved way to approach pro wrestling, as opposed to being like, no, the fans are cheering this person that they're supposed to be booing. Right. We got to do this. Or they're booing this we got to take away this cool thing that they're doing. Like Cesaro's can't do the swing anymore because he's a heel and his move is getting over and we don't want him to be over. So he's got to do that. But in WWE, because they suck at booking baby faces and their baby faces are often just boring putts that always get outsmarted and always get beaten up by the heels. When the heel that's doing cool stuff is facing against this milquetoast boring babyface, that's when you're going to get we all love the heel and hate the babyface dynamic. And I think that's just different between the two different companies. I will say that WWE's, when it came to like crowd reactions, I thought that AEW would do it, and they do it a lot on the taped shows. But for the most part, it was just kind of generic, like crowd audience white noise, where people were just kind of making noise in the background, but you didn't have any real coordinated chants or anything. It was just kind of a way to make sure that there's not silence in the background, which is what I was calling for from the beginning with WWE. WWE did that, but WWE can't help themselves. They have to do these manufactured "this is awesome" chants. They have to do these manufactured "fight forever" chants, and a lot of times it would come across as completely inorganic. And they had these like droning boos that were like the canned noise. And they were so bad because it was literally just people going, boo. And they would just play, and they play it for every heel. And there's no context to it. So it would just be like, it wasn't like the top heels got more booing than like lower card heels. It would just be like constantly booing. Like if you watch 205 Live and Arya Daivari came out and he's getting booed like he's 1985 Roddy Piper, and it's like, come on, like there's not this much heat on this guy. Like it really gave off this impression of inauthenticity. And I know it's all manufactured anyway, but I feel like they could have reeled it in a little bit more. And I'm kind of worried that it's gonna be here to stay, because I think WWE likes the idea of having the control over what crowds to noise the audience is going to make.
Yeah, it's certainly a wait and see, especially with WWE and AEW going back on tour next month. And, we're going back to the point where you're talking about, we don't want to bring in this star, especially during a pandemic. There's been rumors of John Cena coming back for these this whole new tour that they're going through in July. And so that's going to be really curious to see how much of a boost that will be for WWE if, John Cena actually does make some type of appearance, whether it be on SmackDown or on Raw or whatever. But yeah, just a wait and see of how these companies will sort of change their styles, especially since moving to a different environment, because since both of them have always been in Florida for so long, now they're going off into different cities. It's very curious to see the appetite for wrestling, because, these ticket sales, they're close to sold out, but they haven't sold out in minutes like a UFC show has. I know that's something like Meltzer is pointing out, like the appetite for wrestling, it's there, but it's not like super, super hot, like a UFC type show where it does sell out in like 10 minutes or whatever. So I'm very curious to see the appetite for wrestling, how that will be changed, once these shows kick off.
Yeah, and I've heard this thought about it. I haven't seen an update on this, and I haven't read the entire Observer today. I just read the first story, so it might be in there. But I'd be interested in seeing if they've noticed an increase in ticket sales for their shows that are for sale since Double or Nothing. Because to me, as a fan, if AEW is coming to my city and I'm like, I don't know if I want to go, but then I see the crowd at Double or Nothing and I see how much fun everyone appears to be having, I think that would improve ticket sales in some way, because it shows that, look how, this is what a full crowd, you can be a part of this. This is what a full crowd is like at a wrestling show. And AEW, AEW only toured for for weekly Dynamites, October, November, December, January, February, March, 5.5 months.
Yeah.
They were going into all sorts of new markets for their shows. We don't really know what the AEW attendance is going to be like, especially because the company is the company more popular than it was a year and a half ago? Is it less popular than it was? We never gotten a clear indication based off TV viewership because you had competition with NXT, then you didn't have competition with NXT. Now you've got all these preemptions and the show's on Friday at 10. It's hard to kind of gauge what the baseline popularity is of AEW and what the fans' appetite are going to be for shows and what kind of markets they're going to do. I've always thought that, when they go to Los Angeles, it's going to be a big deal because they haven't been there yet. And that's a huge market. And they've got a ton of people from Los Angeles on their roster. When they go to Canada, when they go to London, when they go to, New York City, haven't run a show in New York City yet. They were going to do 13,000 fans at the Prudential Center for Blood and Guts, right before in Newark. Right before the pandemic started. So, they're going to have a show in New York City. I think they're going to do a Madison Square Garden show. Maybe not. Maybe they'll do a Nassau Coliseum show or the Prudential Center in Newark because they weren't able to get MSG previously. But, I think they should do a show. I've already said this. I think they should do a show in Winnipeg.
Yeah.
How do you not do the big arena in Winnipeg and do Chris Jericho versus Kenny Omega in Winnipeg? Like if you do that, do pay-per-view in Winnipeg, that's going to be your main event. Like, I know that's not a huge market to draw from, but I think you could do it with the uniqueness of having two big stars from Winnipeg. Seattle, all these wrestling cities that they haven't been to yet that I think they're going to do really well in. I mean, even I'm a little disappointed, to be honest, that the return to touring has been in, they wanted to stay in cities where they knew they would be able to get, max occupancy. So they stayed in Texas and Florida. I get that. But even like All Out's in Chicago, okay, All Out's always in Chicago. Full Gear's in St. Louis. I think they've already been to St. Louis before. They've definitely been to either St. Louis or Kansas City. I can't remember. It's just, I'd like to see them do new markets. They're coming back to Boston eventually. I still have tickets for my, for my Dynamite that I think was supposed to be in, I want to say it's supposed to be in like July of 2020, and I bought them in February of 2020, and they got pushed back to November. I think they have a date. I think it might be 2022 at this point, but I'm ready. I'm ready to go back. But again, that's the same market. I even know I'm benefiting from it because I get to go, but love to see them go into other markets and see what the touring is like.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tony Khan has confirmed, if not for the pandemic, they would have gone touring in England and done London, a bunch of all these others, city area or other, big tours there. And so that would have been curious for their international expansion as well. Madison Square Garden, like New Japan, they were going to have another Madison Square Garden tickets never went out for that show, but who knows how well that show would have drawn, whether it would have drawn or not, especially without the elites there as well. Because G1 Supercard, you had Ring of Honor there. I think I don't know how much percentage of fans thought the elite were going to be there, but I'm sure some of them may have bought tickets to that G1 Supercard show, thinking the elite were going to be there, but they weren't. But still, it was a very fun show, very good show, and so I'm very curious. Are they going to go to Madison Square Garden, New Japan, once things open up a lot more internationally? And how well will that show draw? Because that's a big unknown. We'll never know how well that was Wrestle Dynasty, they called it. How well that show would have drawn in 2020.
Yeah, I think if I'm AEW New Japan, I'm like, we're running a joint show together at Madison Square Garden.
Yeah,
it's a layup. Like that would sell out. You'd have a big show. Everyone would be talking about it. It gets a strong buzz for that. Similar to the show in New York. I mean, there's a lot of debate about. Well, they sold out Madison Square Garden before. They did that over WrestleMania weekend. I think some people think that they wouldn't have been able to do it on WrestleMania weekend. I kind of think they would have anyway because of the size of the New York market and like I was going to go, I couldn't go to that show because of work commitments. Like I was going to go to that show and I wasn't going to just because this is the first time New Japan was coming to the East Coast really. But yeah, I think, but there's other things going on now. Now, New Japan, if they did it without AEW, you're talking about a major show in America without Kenny Omega, without the Young Bucks, your big, American or Canadian based stars that were really the impetus for your product getting really over in the United States in the first place. So I think it would be tough for them to do a solo show at this point, just with New Japan talent. I just don't think New Japan is as popular in this country as it was a few years ago, pre-AEW, when all of the AEW talent were in New Japan. But getting back to kind of the pandemic era of wrestling, things that let's because this was the original kind of idea. There's things that from the pandemic that you hope stick around. Jason, what is something that you feel like you've seen during the pandemic? It could be anything that while we all welcome the return of fans and welcome the return of touring and welcome the return of business as usual, what are some things that you have noticed that you would like to maybe stick around post-pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, obviously for what I'm going to talk about, there's a lot of mixed bag matches with this type of match, but I wouldn't mind seeing a cinematic match every quarter, like not so frequently, but I think there is something of value there in terms of, especially with like these bigger companies and their production values that they could potentially do. I mean, look at Darby Allin and the production value on his stuff, like it's really good. And so, his cinematic match with Sting, it was very fun to watch. The only complaint was just commentary on that match. The fact there was commentary on that match. I wouldn't mind seeing more cinematic matches, just not on a frequent basis, maybe like once a year type of thing. I feel like AEW, the way they experimented with Double or Nothing with Stadium Stampede, I think that may be a template for them in the future to add, a half taped element and a half live element as well, because I think the live element really helped that match at the end, having ending the match with a huge pop from the crowd. And so obviously, the WWE cinematic matches, they've been mostly putrid, I would say, because most of them involve the Fiend.
They don't have to be.
For what?
Like, they didn't have to. The WWE matches don't have to be terrible cinematic matches.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I think they were done cinematic, like, because the Fiend is involved and because Bray's involved, and I think he's just creatively destroying pro wrestling. Like, those are bad. But if they wanted to do the Boneyard match,
yeah,
like, they could do that, and I think it would work. At Double or Nothing, I was like, man, you got a full arena for people the first time, and it's so great, and you're doing like this long taped match. Like, what are you doing? They did save it at the end by, coming back and Sammy getting the big pop for the win. So I did agree with that. Yeah, I don't see – people are like, I never want to see a cinematic match again. And I'm kind of like that way, but I don't see the harm in doing a cinematic match, doing it well, and putting it on a pay-per-view show because it adds variety to the show. And it makes the matches feel a little bit different. And if you have someone like The Undertaker or Sting – who maybe not always will be in the best situation if they're doing a match in front of a live crowd. Although Sting looked, really good at Double or Nothing.
Yeah, he did.
Like you could throw that in. I don't have a problem with a well done cinematic match. I would prefer like them to not involve the Fiend, and I would prefer for them to at least give off the impression that they were a real wrestling match and not some weird like
a skit, basically.
Like a backstage segment or a skit or a vignette. But yeah, I don't have I think there's a balance that you can find there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what about you? Anything positive from the pandemic? Any sort of aspect you want to see kept forward?
Yeah, I think that certain people and certain promotions understood the kind of action that worked without an audience, and I would like to see some of that remain. I think ROH, for example, ROH basically went, we're going to do, we're an empty building shows, which was a smart move. Empty building shows. We're not going to have all sorts of effects. We're not going to do a fake crowd noise or anything like that. We're just going to have the guys go in there and they're going to wrestle this very serious, straightforward style. And they brought back the Pure title as kind of symbolic of that, which is that we're going to have a real competitive fight feel to our product. And I think that helped ROH a lot. I think it helped reestablish an identity for that promotion that kind of lost it as, independent wrestling spread to larger promotions, and they lost a lot of their key talent. But I think I liked the no nonsense, Jonathan Gresham style approach to pro wrestling, and I like to see that stick around. Other promotions did it as well. Individual talent kind of figured it out more than others when it came to what kind of works in front of a live audience, and it adds nice variety to shows. If people are going to go out there and we're going to wrestle more of a, I don't want to say like a work shoot style, because it wasn't really like that, but more of a very straightforward, we're going to act like the crowd's not even here, it's just me and you, and we're going to go at it kind of approach to pro wrestling. Saw that in the indies too, like other indie promotions that would do empty arena shows. I don't know, did you see the Jeremy Wyatt, Fred Yehai, like Iron Man match that took place? I want to say it was St. Louis Anarchy. It was like last year. It was, it's on YouTube. I recommend people who have an hour to kill and want to see good wrestling, is they just did an Iron Man match, and they had, and the announcers there, and that was it. And they just had a very straightforward, cool pro wrestling match. New Japan Strong, similar, very similar vibe. We're not having fans ringside or wrestlers at ringside cheering. We're not having, the Thunderdome screens. We're not having any of that. It's just pure professional wrestling. And I liked it. I think there were some good things. I think ROH's product, found an identity that had been lacking. I thought New Japan Strong was a fun watch. I thought AEW Dark was a fun watch, if only because like it sounds stupid, but the approach to AEW Dark of being this show that had like only a few people kind of around ringside, like a couple fans watch, a couple wrestlers watching, you'd see someone sitting in like the seats back, like it kind of made it a very cool show to watch, because it kind of felt like you were watching like these people have tryout matches, and that only a few people are watching, and you could see some people that you didn't know about, or maybe see some people they throw out these little Easter egg matches that were cool to people, to really hardcore fans. Like they threw Ren Narita on one of their shows. They'd bring in some independent acts, like they brought in Bear Country for the first time on Dark, and they just kind of did different stuff. Top Flight first made their gimmick debut on Dark, and Dark was a fun watch because of that. It wasn't high stakes wrestling. It wasn't like there were these big feuds going on. It wasn't like there was this hot crowds or these cool. It was just kind of very relaxed and chill, but kind of let you feel like you were on the inside of pro wrestling, and you were watching this young talent, and you were scouting this young talent, and you were seeing people experiment with stuff. It just kind of had a cool vibe, and there was. The pandemic forced different promotions to kind of adapt their product in certain ways, and I think some of them found a kind of a winning formula. Like I think like I said, AEW Dark's better. New Japan Strong was cool. ROH's product was pretty cool. I like that element.
Yeah, I mean that really helped ROH to bring back the pure title and introduce, sort of reintroduce pure rules into the wrestling lexicon, because I'm seeing indie shows like, oh, pure rules match. Maybe they had it before, but I feel like I've seen it more now because Jonathan Gresham and Ring of Honor have brought it back into the lexicon of wrestling fans. And yeah, I do agree that like having that intimate feel is it's a different flavor, because there's this discussion amongst wrestling fans how people are more desensitized or more used to the high flying and the danger of wrestling. I think, there's been discussion of people take that for granted, but this intimate style of wrestling can really help bring out that danger and that physicality of wrestling that we do take for granted, because we just seen so much of wrestling over these past decades. We've seen everything that happens, and guys are just so good at it now. They make it so flawless that we kind of do take it for granted sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I was in one of the pure rules matches that I really liked was from ROH's pay-per-view earlier this year, which was Jonathan Gresham versus Dak Draper. And one of the things in that match was you talk about people being desensitized. You're talking about people don't care about as much about people doing extremely, hard, whether it's guys going through tables or guys doing corkscrew moonsaults or all these high-flying moves that are now just standard across all of wrestling. In this match, Draper versus Gresham, because the pure rules is like you're only allowed to use a closed fist and punch somebody once, and if you do, it's like a caution, and if you do it again, you lose the match. It's kind of like picking up a yellow card in soccer.
Right.
And they wrestle this pure rules match. It's like 15 minutes in. These guys are going back and forth. Draper's the heel. And then at one point when Nick Gresham seems like he's kind of close to finishing him off, Draper just punches him right in the face. And like watching it, you're like, man, what a dick. He punched him right in the face. And like all he did was punch him. Like the most standard wrestling thing you would ever see in your life is a punch to the face. And they made it feel like it meant something because they had introduced this kind of style that, you can watch an indie spot fest match and a guy could do, shooting star press and you're like, whatever, shooting star. This match, you saw someone punch somebody and you're like, oh man, he punched him. Like, you're right. Anything can work if you introduce that kind of style. It's interesting if like we'll see that moving forward. I think ROH is definitely going to stick with it because I think they found something. Be interesting to see what happens with AEW Dark and New Japan Strong. Will New Japan try to, have 200 people at their shows? Maybe. And that might be cool. I'm not against it. AEW Dark, I almost want it to stay the same. Like, I don't want them to have to work in front of an audience because I enjoyed the kind of intimate atmosphere of it even more.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting to see where it goes, because before they would have like 10 or 15 matches on the card. But I think we've seen recently with these past couple Dark and Elevation shows that like they've really cut down the time on these matches. And well, not just they cut down on the card itself, but some matches are game time. And so it's kind of a weird sort of thing because, yeah, some guys, they are getting more time in the ring, but at the same time, like there's less matches on the shows. It kind of the appeal in some weird way, so I think some people bemoaned like, oh my god, there's 12 matches on this card, it's like a 2-hour show, but at the same time that's kind of the appeal for the hardcore Dark and Elevation fans, was that there were these like super mega cards, even though they featured like very much talents.
The appeal was that I can't explain. The appeal of Dark is almost that it's meaningless.
Yeah, that's true.
It's just an easy show to watch. No one ever microanalyzes what's going on Dark. No one ever talks about like, oh, I can't believe this person lost on Dark, or they did this move, or that kind of stuff. You just kind of put it on in the background if you want generic wrestling on that's not insulting. And and I think there's an appeal to seeing squash matches. Dark was a lot of squash matches. It was main roster talent. Like Wardlow's out here and he's going to beat up some jobber in 2 minutes and that's it. And that would be like half of the shows, the matches on Dark. And they'd splice in more competitive matches, but it was kind of, again, a change of pace. Dynamite likes to focus on, really good wrestling. Really, they have, a lot of matches that go over 10 minutes. They have a lot of action and stuff. They don't have, this felt more like, especially if you grew up, and I didn't, we're way too young for this, but if you grew up on like, WWF Superstars, where those shows were just 4-minute squash matches over and over and over again. And the commentary between, Bobby Heenan and Gorilla Monsoon carried it because it was funny. You see a similar, I think they're trying to push a similar dynamic both with Tony Schiavone and Paul White on Dark Elevation, and then Taz on Excalibur on AEW Dark is like kind of like, these guys are funny and witty. They're going to be on, put it on in the background while you're doing something else. It's on YouTube. It's free. You can get it on any device. It's very accessible. And it's just fun. And I don't know if it makes sense to do it the way it is. They can tape it before episodes of Dynamite. They can tape it, in empty buildings in Daly's place when they got time or whatever. I don't know what the future of Dark is, but I'm kind of interested and I kind of want it to stay the same.
Well, it's going to be interesting for the future of AEW because of the pandemic, they couldn't be around each other that often. And so they would, for 1 week, they would just tape Dynamite live, and then the next week Dynamite would be taped. Mm-hmm. And so curious to see what happens when they go back live, when they are live every single week, how that dynamic is going to change, who knows. Like Rampage, I think Tony Khan has said like the first episode will be live, but some other episodes, will be taped, at some other date or whatever. And so it's going to be interesting to see how they do all these tape shows. especially since like the appeal of AEW was that like a lighter schedule was the appeal for it. But I don't know like how they're going to tape all their schedules. Obviously, it'd be lighter than anything else that WWE does, but still, it's just be interesting to see how they fit in all these other shows and just tape everything. Especially presumably this will be in front of a crowd as well, because I don't think it would be fun if Dark went back into like the a few people scattered, maybe like a couple lucky fans, they do like a raffle or whatever, and it's like, hey, you get to be in the Dark taping. There won't be that many people, but you'll be the very few people in that crowd. But still, I don't know what they're gonna do for these tape shows.
Yeah, like with Rampage is interesting because they say it's going to be it's going to be at the same level as Dynamite. It's going to be a big show.
Yeah.
So they're going to be shooting big matches and they're going to be shooting big angles. And I do wonder how they're going to do that, because I think you can draw reasonable television crowds for Dynamite. Can you draw reasonable television crowds for Rampage? Can you draw them, are you going to be exhausting more markets because you're going to be drawing twice? Are you going to tape them after Dynamite, which is going to be kind of difficult because then you got spoilers coming out and you've got fans maybe leaving because the show's going too long. And I don't know. I think Rampage I could see being what I would do, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I say what I would do, like I know everything in the situation. I don't, but potentially they could do. Sounds like a decent idea to me, at least, would be to you run Dynamite live on Wednesday, and then you do Rampage at maybe a smaller venue in a smaller location, outside of the bigger city that you're taping Dynamite. For example, to give Boston for an example, they do Dynamite at the Agganis Arena, which is like 6,000 people in Boston, and then 2 days later you're doing Rampage at the Lowell Memorial Coliseum, which is like Lowell Memorial Auditorium, which is 45 minutes north of Boston, and I don't know, 12 or 1,300 people. Different kind of feel, different kind of setting. And you could do that for wherever you're in. You're in Dallas, Texas. Do tape something big at a big arena in Dallas, and then do something at more of a theater kind of atmosphere. I think it would be cool. Like do New York City, then do Hammerstein Ballroom for Rampage. Or every major city is going to have these venues around. I think that might be cool because it would give it a different dynamic too if you saw it in more of an auditorium or a theater kind of setting than if it was just the same kind of basketball arena that they go to.
Yeah, you bring up a good point with the spoiler thing. Like that was a big appeal for many of these promotions where they could tape a bunch of shows and there was no fear of spoilers except for the talent, but obviously the talent, they're not going to spoil what happens. There's a good trust there. And
you could leak out stuff. You could be like, they would leak out stuff. They'd be like, they'd tell, the dirt sheets. They'd tell whoever. Dave Meltzer, Sean Ross Sapp, and be like, this match next week's like going to be like really amazing.
Yeah.
And then they'd be like, and then someone would write like, I'm hearing great things about this.
Or even like Fred Rosser, who would accidentally reveal that Jon Moxley was at NJPW Starling. I saw my taping one time. It's like, oh wait, what?
Yeah, I think that's cool. I think that I'm interested in knowing how it's going to happen. Another thing that it's not. I hope it stays around, and it's not something that's like obvious to fans and doesn't really make an impact. Is that while the pandemic had tons of challenges for the talent, one of the things that I think is that it made travel and planning much easier for these guys, especially the people in WWE. If you were in WWE, you're doing house shows every weekend. You're traveling all over the country. You're doing all this stuff like that. You go to the pandemic, it's just if you're on Raw, you're doing Raw. You're taping. You're going once a week to the building in Orlando or the Tampa area, which most of the talent live in already. So they're in their bed every night, and they're showing up, and they get to they do their stuff, and then they leave, and they don't have to go fly to another part of the country, or just the travel is so different. And I think that probably benefited talent. It'd be a nice gig if you can get it. It went from being a very difficult job from a travel aspects to being basically like you go into work once a week and you do your thing, and then you have 6 other days to mess around. And I know it was said during when WWE kind of cracked down on third-party edicts and people had to lose their Twitch streams, one of the things that was said was like, the talent has a lot of time on their hands because they're not traveling because of the pandemic, and they got a lot of time at home, and something that they can do to make extra money is do this Twitch stream, record these cameos, do these kind of bonus things because they've just got a lot of time on their hands. And I think it's good for the talent to have that much time on their hands. I know for AEW talent, they were only doing one show a week, but they would have to fly to a different spot in the country, depending on when the show is. Now you just fly into Jacksonville. You're staying in, a lot of them, I know a lot of talent relocated to Florida or relocated to the Jacksonville area just because of the convenience of it. You're staying in the same, you're staying in your same bed every night, or you're staying at the same hotel at least every week. And you're, taping your show, and then you tape maybe a match for Dark, and then you maybe tape next week's Dynamite, and then that's all you're doing for 2 weeks. Then you go home. You can do whatever you want. And it's such a difference from the grind of the travel schedule and doing 3 or 4 or 5 shows a week and having to fly all these other places. And then you're doing international tours. And I hope that there can be more of a balance, because I think it's benefited the talent. It makes the job easier. I'm sure it helps people physically not having to wrestle as frequently. Maybe it hurt them financially because they were, there weren't as many shows. But I think in general, it was a nice change. And I hope that we kind of see, I know WWE's been doing it in recent years anyway, winding down the house show schedule, not doing as much of that. And because I think it benefits the talent. It doesn't really make a difference to fans because, but it does benefit, it makes the job a lot easier for the talent and makes it much more bearable for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common thing, especially from WWE talent, is the grind of the travel. And, I think the big thing is they can cut down house shows, but I think the big thing is just the third party stuff. AEW, any other talent outside WWE can go on Cameo or have their own podcast or do their own, sell their own shirts and all this other stuff. But obviously WWE, that was a big thing. Like, they were mad about that because there was no house shows to sell their merch and other stuff. I think they'd be fine with less house shows, just as long as they can find other ways to make money. I think that's the big thing there. And so, yeah, again, it's a cost-cutting measure to cut down house shows because they're really not profitable for WWE.
No,
but I think they weren't. But for talent, they were, beneficial because that was a way to sell more merch for them to make more money for themselves. But as long as they can make a lot of money other ways, that's the big thing.
Yeah, I mean, it did hurt them. Well, they're working less dates. You work in less dates, you're going to get less money. You're going to get your downside guarantee. Everyone's contract is different in WWE, but in general, that was a big blow, was losing the dates you were working. But I mean, depending on the wrestler you are, it does come with a certain balance. Would impact them negatively in the sense that I think matches, especially involving maybe less experienced talent, matches would have been better if we weren't just seeing them only on television, if they had time to hammer out a lot of house show matches to get their chemistry right. I think in recent weeks, an example of that would be Rhea Ripley and Asuka. They just don't seem to have any chemistry together. That you would think that the matches would have been better than they were. But a big element of that, I think, would have been solved if you had the house show loop and they could have done, 20 matches with them on house shows before putting them on television or before putting another match on television. But you don't have that without the house shows. So when they do it again, they haven't really ironed anything out at that point. So there are wrestlers who lost experience. Obviously, the true developmental talent in NXT, it's rough. They used to have the NXT house show tour where they'd go around Florida and they'd wrestle in small venues, but it would help break these people into the industry that had never wrestled before. But if you're not wrestling on NXT television, you're not wrestling in front of a crowd. You're just doing, forward rolls in the warehouse. You're not doing, you're not learning to really work in front of an audience. And I think that has maybe been a setback for some of those prospective talent. We don't know because we don't really know, who's ready and who's not. But I think that definitely is going to play a factor when it comes to talent development, just people having less matches.
Yeah, especially where now people can work in front of a crowd. They know how to react to a crowd and all that stuff there. Because like you said earlier, the WWE style is very predictive of working in front of a crowd, whether for good or for bad. The bad parts obviously being, sitting on a headlock and just waiting for the crowd to, get fired up for the babyface or whoever. But still, yeah, a big part of wrestling in general is just working in front of an audience and just reacting to them, putting on the right spots in the right time. And so I think that's I think we'll definitely see a big change in that in terms of the in-ring stuff. I don't think it'll be dramatically, better than before, but I think there'll definitely be a noticeable difference in terms of just guys, learning how to react to a crowd, and especially for guys like who've been out for so long, Christian Cage. Like Christian has been out for so long, and he's wrestled in front of the small crowds that they had before, and he worked the Battle Royal, of course, and Double or Nothing with that the sold out crowd. But I'm very curious to see him, start get his wheels back on track. So he's gone on track on the in-ring stuff, but still just everything else, psychology and all that stuff. I'm very curious to see a guy like him back out in the crowd as well.
Yeah, I know, and it's been difficult for people to learn certain things about what they're doing, even more experienced talent. I know Chris Jericho talked about this. He said basically talent in AEW would ask him, "Oh, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Do you think I should keep doing this?" And he would say, like, "Yeah, man, I don't really know because I can't tell what the crowd is doing. For all I know, what you're doing is awesome and it's getting super over." Like, it's really hard to tell. I know we talked about like Drew McIntyre, like his push, like, is he really over? Is he not? Like, how over is he? Who knows? Is Roman Reigns going to be booed? Is Roman Reigns going to be cheered? I don't know. I know they're telling people at the Thunderdome to do this on the screens, but that's not what the live crowd's going to say. And I know, like, I'll take to go to New Japan. Like I found the Evil push and the Evil title reign in the Dick Togo interference really tedious, and I know a lot of other people didn't care for it, and it wasn't a highlight of New Japan. But if the crowd's been allowed to make noise, and Evil was getting like this nuclear heat, and Dick Togo was getting this huge heat, and when the babyface knocked Dick Togo off the apron, the crowd went crazy, the act would feel completely different, and I'd probably be really into it because it's doing its job of helping the babyface get over and building heat and all this kind of good stuff that you would want to see out of pro wrestling. But we don't know because we're not allowed to get that barometer because the fans either are not around or not allowed to make noise.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the errors New Japan made during the pandemic was when they made a transition into trying to get more heat, they chose the wrong time to do that.
Yes, because where heat did not exist.
Yeah, exactly. Like, the idea of that, like you said, having Evil be this big heel, the crowd hates on him, they're throwing, their drinks or whatever at him because they hate him so much, that's appealing, but that's not possible during that time period of the panic. And so that's why it's very largely viewed as a failure, the Evil title push, but it could have been a success under a different circumstance. Maybe if they did it next year, perhaps that could have been a success there, but we'll never really know, right? Because, they chose the wrong time to do this push.
Yeah, I agree. That seems to be my sense of it too, which is like, again, if he was getting nuclear heat, we would feel completely different about it. And some people will say like, "Oh yeah, this Evil push is great. He's getting this heat," and it's like I can't tell. Like, and that's one thing. And you go to AEW or WWE or indie wrestling, and it's hard to tell who's getting over and who's not getting over. And I think I'm really interested in seeing when. So we saw Double or Nothing, and we saw people, basically everyone was over in a certain way. Maybe some things weren't as over as you thought they would be, like the Cody versus Anthony Ogogo match would be one of them. But for the most part, like, there was just energy, and the crowd was so happy to be there. And people were like, "Oh, this is going to be great. This is going to be this big honeymoon period. When WWE goes back on the road, they're going to get the same kind of atmosphere, and it's going to liven the product up, and it's going to make everything feel great." And while I think it's definitely going to be better than the Thunderdome, if I watch Raw, I'm like, who on Raw is like getting all this momentum as a personality that people are going to be really into the way they were into Hangman Page, the way they were into Britt Baker, the way they were into Darby Allin, the way they were into Jungle Boy. Like, who on Raw right now feels like they're going to get like this big pop and this big reaction from the crowd? Because the show just feels lifeless. Dynamite in the pandemic era did not feel like a lifeless show. Like, it wasn't a surprise to me that Jungle Boy it wasn't a surprise to me that Eddie Kingston was over with the fan base. It was a surprise to him, but it wasn't a surprise like, oh yeah, everyone likes Eddie Kingston. He's been awesome. When I watch Raw, I'm like, okay, Drew might get, pretty good babyface pop, even though I feel like he's been kind of hurt by not regaining his championship after losing it to the fucking Miz. Lashley, maybe, but I think they cooled Lashley off when they got rid of the Hurt Business. So I don't even know if he's going to be that over. Rhea Ripley, no. Asuka Charlotte, no. Who on Raw is going to be like the guy that feels like got this all momentum that you're going to be like, whoa, I can't believe how over that person is, or I'm surprised. Like who on Raw is going to be like that? And I'll be interested to see what happens, because I don't think WWE is going to come back and have like the same kind of crowd that they had at Double or Nothing, because I don't feel like, especially the Raw brand, I do not feel like that product is hot at all. I don't feel like they have any characters with any real momentum. And I think fans will be happy to be back, but I don't think there's going to be individuals that are going to be like getting big pops and stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely a very opposite view of crowds in general, thinking that like they're just gonna come back and just cheer for everything, where we've seen in other sports hasn't been the case.
Mm-hmm.
The fans have, they cheer when they cheer, but if something's bad,
They might cheer
boo.
at the start, like the tip off or whatever, but they're not cheering like, oh, our team's getting our brains beaten, we're still gonna cheer. No, they're fans. They're not just gonna blindly cheer for anything. That's when Vince will be ready for it with the button on the or Kevin Dunn will be ready with the button to make sure that there's noise.
Yeah, that may be the case. When the crowd is, maybe not they're not booing, but maybe they're just apathetic thing. It's okay, that thing's happening. Okay, Jackson Riker Elias in a tag match, whatever.
Yeah, rematch tag match. Like, their booking's not going to change. People seem to think that, once WWE goes back on the road, like, everything's going to change. Like, no, Raw has sucked forever, okay? It sucks more now because it's in this cave or it's in this Thunderdome, but the booking is not going to be better. They're still doing rematches. They're still going to do shitty finishes with DQs. They're still going to do – it's Elias and Jackson Riker. It's Cedric and Shelton having a match in 2 minutes. It's going to be, it's going to be the same. It's the same people running it. It's not like they're tanking these shows on purpose, okay?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even with like, if they were to do something dramatic, like a call up, it would be unplanned. Like they would just do it for a quick pop.
Yes.
Say like Io Shirai maybe, because she hasn't been on NXT TV in a while. So like maybe she's be called up later in a month or so. But even if she does, there's cleanup for her if she does get called up. I doubt like they have this very elaborate, 3-month plan for Io Shirai, which takes on Rhea Ripley or takes on Asuka or whatever. Like they're just doing it for a quick pop, because it's just something new on Raw, which is like people are just going to cheer because it's something new, it's something different, rather than just having rematch and over again. But it's going to be very short term, is the big thing.
Pre-pandemic, WWE's audiences were really lifeless by historical standards. If you go back and watch like 2013, 2014 WWE, like not that long ago, the crowd is so much more into it. You've got way more people who are getting big pops. You're getting just more enthusiasm about the product in general. I think years and years of the product being on a real decline. I think Daniel Bryan never getting a serious push, and them fighting with Daniel Bryan over pushing him or not pushing him, and not reacting to the fans cheering for him. I think pushing Roman Reigns at all costs, even though the fans didn't want him. All of that created an environment where apathy was like the main reaction from a lot of fans. If you watch 2019 WWE, you watch a Raw, it's not like the thing is like, it's not like everyone's over and everyone's cheering. It's a lot of like there's almost nobody with that. There was almost nobody really with that Daniel Bryan level of popularity. Like WWE, like 2014, 2015, 2016 WWE, you had people that the fans are really behind and the company didn't push them. But you at least had people where it's like, if they wanted to, they could really push this person, they'd be a big star. By the time 2019 rolled around, I think the fans had been taught that don't cheer for these people because WWE is never going to push them anyway. And the result is a lot of lifeless crowds. They would still pop at certain points for at certain times, and they pop for title changes. But the energy of the average show was turned way down. I don't think a lot of people realize that, because I don't think a lot of people are going back and watching 2013, 2014 WWE. It's not like a super popular time because it's kind of in the more recent past. And I know if you watch the Attitude Era, people accept that the Attitude Era's crowds had an energy level that isn't going to be matched today, and that's just a historical fact. But even 2000, like not that long ago, the crowd was here. The average crowd was here, and then now in 2019, it's here. And I don't think that's improved during the pandemic. I don't think they've gotten a bunch of people over that the crowd wants to cheer for now. I think that they've taught the crowd to not get too invested in people, and unless they're really happen to be into Roman Reigns or Drew McIntyre or someone who is kind of protected, they're not going to really react. I think with a call-up, it's a similar thing. Like, call-ups used to, when someone got called up from WWE in 2015, it was like, oh my God, this person's here. And now if they come up, like, the difference between like a Kevin Owens call-up and Keith Lee call-up is huge. And the reason people are less enthusiastic is because we've seen what a lot of these NXT names are capable of on the main roster, or what Vince thinks they're capable of, which is not much. And yeah, right. If Io Shirai comes up, a lot of fans would be like, well, this is kind of sudden and unplanned. What's she going to do? It just, to me, like, I just think WWE's like atmosphere around their shows is relatively lifeless. And I wouldn't be banking on like the same kind of energy that you saw at Double or Nothing translating over to WWE.
Yeah, I think only at first maybe because just like like when the show starting perhaps, but like yeah, as the show goes on, the fans will see the same typical booking. I think that's when the crowd will sort of lessen down a bit from the initial like, oh hey, wait, fans are back pop kind of thing.
Yeah, when you said Elias and Jackson, I'm like, yes, that's perfect. Like that match is still taking place in front of fans. It's not like that's a specific Thunderdome special. This is how they book. They're not gonna. It's not like they're gonna bring in new writers. It's not like Vince is gonna relinquish control. It's not like they got all these brilliant ideas they're waiting on. They're saving. This is what their product is like. I think SmackDown will fare a little bit better because I think even though I think he's starting to fade a little bit, like Roman Reigns is still has a novelty as a heel. People are into that act. The WWE fan base is relatively into that act. I think he'll be over, and with the show being a little bit shorter, the fans will be more lively for that. I think they'll be into Bianca. I think they're into Bianca Belair. I think they'd be into Banks comes back and feuds with Belair, which might happen. I think SmackDown will have a little bit more life. They've got a little bit more people with momentum. On the Raw side, I'm like, this is really bleak. I don't think that Nia Jax, the Nia Jax match is getting over big. I don't think they're reacting to Nia Jax like she's Darby Allin.
Or Reginald either.
Yeah, like it's just, I mean, we can go on. This isn't, we can go on and on about what's wrong with Raw, but I don't see like the same kind of enthusiasm carrying at WWE shows as I see at this. And AEW is not going to have that same kind of enthusiasm for most of their shows. Double or Nothing was the first show back. It was a pay-per-view. It was a large fly-in audience, so you had the most hardcore fans. You're not going to have that kind of energy at like Dynamite at the HEB Center in Cedar, Texas. You're not going to have that same kind of momentum at some of these, the typical house shows. You're going to get more, less hardcore fans, maybe more casual fans. But I still think that they'll have people that will be over and will have real momentum as opposed to WWE, where I feel like the product is so stale at this point, and there's not a lot of reasons to be invested in talent from a fan perspective that you'll see that kind of momentum. Is their first show, is WWE's, I can't remember, is their first show going to be Money in the Bank, or is it going to be like a Raw?
It's a SmackDown and then Money in the Bank and then Raw. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, that makes sense from a touring perspective. Yeah, like I would think if Money in the Bank, I would say, okay, that would be a big show. I think people will be into that because it's a pay-per-view that has a relatively good track record. Although I think Money in the Bank is another thing where it's like, I think people care a lot less about who wins Money in the Bank than they did like a few years ago, just because of the way that has been treated. But I still think people will be up for that show, and SmackDown will work. I think I think it'll work on SmackDown. Like, like one of the reasons this show Double or Nothing works so well is because you brought all the fans back for like a really good pay-per-view show with a lot of anticipated matches with like the Young Bucks and Eddie Kingston and Jon Moxley, and then the triple threat for the world title and Britt Baker winning the title and Stadium Stampede. I feel like you had like matches people really were looking forward to. Like a go-home episode for SmackDown, especially because like who's Roman Reigns going to face at the pay-per-view? Like, is it going to be Jimmy Uso? Like, is that really a hot program? Is it going to be Cesaro again? We're still a ways away. There's still one more pay-per-view away. Edge is rumored to come back. Maybe Edge comes back and feuds with Edge. Maybe that's something, but I don't think that's like a huge deal either. I feel like that's part of the problem with Reigns is that there's no one around that people feel like is a real threat to him. So his feuds are going to start people losing interest in the feuds, but that's kind of a different conversation. Get ready to wrap this up. Jason, you got anything else you want to add? about the death to the pandemic era of wrestling? Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think the big thing is that I think during the pandemic there's a study referenced about the 1916 flu pandemic, how after that sports really got a big surge, and I think people are anticipating that for wrestling as well. And so I'm curious to see what that surge looks like and see what happens after that sort of like a surge or honeymoon period of fans coming back. Obviously there will be a positive atmosphere, but we have all this talk, oh, wrestling is bigger than ever. Wrestling is growing more and more. I'm very curious to see how true that is, because obviously, like, TV and money wise, sure, wrestling is huge, making tons of money. But for the fan, even for the workers themselves, seeing that environment in the live crowds, I'm very curious to see how bigger, or whether it just same as it was pre-pandemic. Very curious to see how those things will play out.
Yeah, I know that like the NBA playoffs this year, the viewership is up pretty high from last year. And
Yep.
obviously the big difference is that the last year was in the bubble in Orlando, and this year you've got, in some cases, full arenas for these games, and it's real sports the way you remembered it, just like Double or Nothing was wrestling the way you remembered it. And I think that could play a factor. We know that ratings really across the board went down during the pandemic. There's a big drop off on WWE, and there was a less of a drop off, but still a noticeable one for AEW. Will we see a boost from live fans? I mean, I wonder if I know there are wrestling fans out there who are like, yeah, I can't do without the fans. I'll watch again when fans come back. I think that's a slippery slope to bank on those fans coming back. I think, like a lot of people, when they realize that they're not going to watch Raw every Monday night, and they have 3 hours now on Monday night that's not dedicated to watching a show they don't particularly like, they're not going to just come back because they're fans. And also at the same time, people are want to go out and about, and they don't want to be home all the time, especially now in the summer months. Like people are wanting to travel. People are going to want to do stuff outside. They want to go hang out with their buddies, stuff that you couldn't do, during the pandemic, when one of the things you could do was sit on your ass and watch television. So that'll be interesting. It will be interesting to see what kind of business changes we see. And unfortunately, with like things like the NBA playoffs going on, and AEW being preempted, it's going to be a while before we kind of feel like we see real concrete evidence to suggest, okay, is business up, is business down, is it the same? It's going to be hard to tell.
Yeah, for sure. Just wait and see. We're a month away from these tours coming up. MLW, they're going to be doing it on Philly as well, so that's going to be really exciting to see how they do as well.
Mm-hmm.
They've been doing a lot of TV deals as they've been signing new people with this MLW draft series that they got going on. So some interesting people they've been signed as well. And so very curious to see, well, not only just WWE and AEW, but you also have all of wrestling as well, do a lot of interesting things. But what that momentum looks like, post pandemic, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on outside of like the major, few promotions that we did talk mostly about. You look at, I think Impact has raised its profile considerably since the pandemic started. They got on Access TV. They've had they've had Kenny Omega as their champion. Like, I think that Impact, once they get fans back, they have some room to grow, hopefully. NWA's trying after they were really hurt by the pandemic. They were really hurt by the shutdown. I think they're short on talent. We'll see what they're able to put together. I haven't enjoyed what I've seen from them since they've kind of come back. I feel like their booking is really scattershot. MLW's, making moves. They're signing people. They probably don't have a working relationship with WWE, but that was rumored at least a few months ago. They're ready to go. And MLW, they were gaining some momentum pre-pandemic, and they've seemed to hit on something with the kind of the lucha libre in America, and pushing that a little bit more seriously. Although that's been kind of pipped by Ring of Honor, who's now employing the entire. What is it? I can't remember. What's Rush's father's name? It's Brazo de Plata or something like that.
No, is it the Beastia?
Yeah,
Del Ring.
Bestia del Ring. I'm sorry, I was thinking of a different wrestling family. The entire Bestia del Ring family is now just like in Ring of Honor. So Ring of Honor is definitely doing the Ring of Honor is interesting promotion. We talked about them earlier with like they're doing like leaning really heavily into like we're gonna push Mexican stars and play into
Yeah.
lucha libre, but we're also gonna have the Jonathan Gresham pure wrestling kind of cap. I've enjoyed Ring of Honor. I think it's interesting promotion at this point in time after kind of being in the wilderness after losing so much talent. And all the indies. Look, WWE's cutting people. WWE cut some people that are going to be out there, and not all of them are going to end up in AEW. And the indies, have been hurting for talent because they've been, AEW sucked up a bunch of talent. WWE signed a bunch of talent. Ring of Honor signed talent. There'll be talent that's out there that will be looking for the indies, and I think it's going to help them. And I'll be happy to return to independent wrestling. Indie wrestling wasn't that big during the pandemic for obvious reasons. I watched a lot of the WrestleMania weekend events, and by the end of it, I was like, okay, there's not a lot here for me.
Sure.
Unfortunately, I saw some good matches. There's a few handful of talent out there, but a lot of it was like, it's going to take me a while for me to go back to indie wrestling because I watched a lot over the weekend and I was like, this is the product's not that great, but got a lot more talent coming in. I think you got a lot more enthusiasm about going to wrestling shows. So hopefully that will help out the indies. And look, it was a really difficult time for the pro wrestling period. TV money, guaranteed TV money really carried the day for the bigger promotions, but we're coming up at a brighter, more optimistic time for pro wrestling in general, and it should be really fun.
Yeah, definitely can't wait to go back and to watch indie shows. We got all the local promotions here in New England. You have Beyond Wrestling, Chaotic Wrestling, Limitless. So we have indie stars. I'm very excited to see Galen Garcia live. He's a very impressive young talent that's killing it right now in the indies.
Have you been to Limitless before?
No, I haven't.
It's
way far from me.
Yeah, it's really funny that like for a long time, New England really, despite the fact that Boston, me and Jason both live in the Boston area. We live like 45 minutes away from each other, but for people who don't know, but the Boston area was always a really big wrestling city, always has been. The WWE would come here and we're always one of the strongest drawing WWE cities, really passionate fan base. Never really quite got when indies were still weren't going in like the 2000s, never really found the right kind of indie. Ring of Honor used to tour here a lot. Then they didn't get, when they were bought by Sinclair, they didn't have local television at the time. So they kind of stopped touring like Massachusetts. If you wanted to see them, you'd go down to Providence, Rhode Island. But we never really had like a really hot indie promotion kind of around until Beyond kind of relocated from Providence to Worcester. Even though those are like equidistant from my house, but that was like, okay, indie, big, like I would say like a top indie, an indie that people have heard of is coming to Boston area. And then Limitless popped up, and Limitless is I think it's in Augusta, Maine, which is like really like the middle of nowhere. It's like probably like 4 or 5 hours from the Boston area. I've never driven up there, so I don't know, but it's not close. So it's kind of like the last spot you would expect to see like an indie gain some real momentum, but it's a credit to the money they're willing to spend to bring in to name talent, the booking of the promotion to gain kind of a notoriety that people in other parts of the country are like, oh yeah, there was this match with Daniel Garcia on Limitless Wrestling, and I'd be like, wow, like Limitless Wrestling, like Augusta, Maine. I think they're in Augusta. I kind of want to look that up now, but I don't want to. If it's in Lewiston, I don't want to be disparaging the fine people of Lewiston, Maine. Their next show is in Yarmouth, Maine. That doesn't help me at all. Anyway, they're in Maine. And they're not like in a part of Maine that's close to people in Maine. They're in a part that's like really far away from people in Maine.
Yeah.
So, Limitless Wrestling geography aside, good. And like that's just one thing. But you look, Buddy Murphy shows up in the indies, like that would be really interesting. I don't like someone like Aleister Black, I think is more like, AEW or New Japan bound, or you're going back to Europe or something like that. I don't think he's like someone's going to be popping up, but some of these people that WWE released will be showing up on the indies. And I'd be interested to see like when PWG comes back. Obviously, like most of the people involved in PWG work for AEW.
Yeah, exactly.
Will I know? Like I'm trying. I think. Well, I think Excalibur is the only owner of PWG who works for AEW, but you got like Young Bucks, obviously, are PWG guys. People like Rick Knox was obviously a PWG guy. He's a referee. Um, a ton of talent. I believe Tony Khan used to go to PWG shows. So,
Yep.
like, I'll be interested to see like if they should be able to get AEW talent. Like John Moxley would probably work a PWG show if he could. You know, if he's gonna wrestle, if he wants to wrestle Nick Gage in a parking lot, he probably wants to go to Reseda, California, too. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what the indies do and what some of these other promotions are able to do. But we're running up on time, so I want to wrap things up there. Appreciate everybody who's been watching, who's been listening. Like, comment, subscribe. Let us know what you think, what you're excited about for wrestling crowds to return, what you're going to miss or what you'd like to see continue in the pandemic era. Let us know. We're always receptive to feedback, and catch us later. We'll catch you later.